I used to think there was something quietly wrong with the way my mind worked. It wasn't anything dramatic that people noticed right away. I had a stable job, paid my bills on time, remembered birthdays, and rarely missed deadlines. From the outside, I probably looked organized, maybe even dependable. But behind every ordinary day was a mind that refused to stop processing things long after everyone else had moved on. A casual conversation from Tuesday could still be playing in my head on Friday. A simple decision about what to order for dinner could somehow become a 20-minute internal debate. Friends laughed about it. "You make everything harder than it needs to be," one of them once told me while we stood in front of a restaurant menu. I laughed too, but I also wondered why choosing between two meals felt strangely exhausting. It wasn't just restaurants. I would spend ages comparing headphones before buying a pair that cost less than one day's salary. I opened dozens of browser tabs while planning a weekend trip that lasted only 2 days. I rewrote text messages several times before sending them because one sentence sounded slightly colder than another. None of these choices changed my life in any meaningful way, yet my brain treated them as if they deserved a full investigation. The part that bothered me even more happened after conversations. If someone made an unclear comment during a meeting, I couldn't simply forget about it. I'd replay every sentence while driving home, wondering what they really meant. Did I misunderstand? Were they disappointed? Had I missed something important? Everyone else seemed able to leave work at work. I carried unfinished conversations around like open tabs that refused to close. One evening I met an old friend for coffee after not seeing each other for months. We talked for nearly 3 hours. As we stood outside saying goodbye, my friend casually mentioned, "You've always overthought things." It wasn't said with cruelty. If anything, it sounded affectionate. I smiled and waved goodbye, but that sentence followed me home. I kept asking myself whether it was true or whether I simply cared more about details than most people did. That night I slept badly because my brain kept replaying the conversation, searching for clues hidden between ordinary words. A week later, I found myself talking about this with someone much older than me during lunch. I admitted how tired I felt from constantly thinking. Instead of telling me to relax, they asked a question I didn't expect. When you're stuck thinking about something, are you trying to prove you're right, or are you trying to understand it completely? I paused because I had never separated those two ideas before. I realized I wasn't trying to win arguments inside my head. I genuinely couldn't let go until everything made sense. They nodded and said they had recently read about something psychologists call the need for cognition, a tendency where some people naturally enjoy or even feel compelled to think deeply until they reach a satisfying explanation. They weren't diagnosing me or offering excuses. They simply mentioned it in passing before changing the subject. But that phrase stayed with me. That evening I searched for more information. What surprised me wasn't that the concept existed. It was learning that researchers had found meaningful connections between this tendency and higher levels of reasoning ability. Apparently, for some people, an unanswered question creates genuine mental discomfort, almost like an unfinished melody that keeps demanding its final note. I had always assumed everyone experienced that feeling and simply handled it better than I did. Discovering that some minds naturally keep processing information until they feel complete changed the way I interpreted years of frustration. I remember leaning back in my chair after reading several studies and quietly saying to myself, I never knew there was an actual name for this. That wasn't an excuse for overthinking every detail, but it explained why unfinished situations seemed to follow me long after everyone else had forgotten them. Around the same time, another problem became impossible to ignore. I was helping my family replace an aging refrigerator. It should have been simple. We had narrowed the options to 3 similar models with almost identical prices. My family expected the decision to take 15 minutes. Instead, I spent hours reading reviews, comparing energy consumption, repair histories, shelf layouts, and even door hinge designs. At one point someone laughed and said, "At this rate, the old refrigerator will die before you decide." Everyone else voted quickly, while I kept finding one more comparison worth making. Eventually another family member simply chose one without me, because they were tired of waiting. I felt strangely disappointed, not because I disliked the refrigerator, but because I hadn't finished understanding the trade-offs. Later that night I noticed something odd. I wasn't upset about the purchase itself. I was bothered that I hadn't reached my own internal point where the decision felt complete. That realization led me down another rabbit hole. During another evening of reading, I discovered research describing something called maximizing. I had always believed indecisive people simply struggled to make choices, but maximizing describes something different. Some people automatically search for the absolute best option, rather than an option that's simply good enough. The fascinating part was that this strategy doesn't switch off for trivial decisions. The same mental process used for important career choices can also activate while choosing cereal or a movie. That surprised me more than anything. I had assumed my brain would naturally recognize which decisions deserve serious analysis. Instead, it often treated tiny choices with the same intensity as life-changing ones. Suddenly, dozens of memories made sense. Standing frozen in grocery aisles, reading hotel reviews until midnight for a vacation that lasted a weekend, watching trailers for 40 minutes before finally deciding I was too tired to watch any movie at all. One Saturday I tested an experiment almost by accident. I was meeting friends for lunch and once again everyone started discussing where to eat. Normally I would immediately begin comparing menus, travel time, prices, and ratings. Instead I silently gave myself 90 seconds. If no obvious problem appeared within that time, I would accept whichever restaurant seemed good enough. I expected to feel anxious afterward, convinced I had made the wrong choice. Instead, something unexpected happened. During lunch I realized nobody else was evaluating whether another restaurant would have served slightly better food. Everyone was simply enjoying the conversation. I couldn't remember the last time I had been so mentally present during an ordinary meal. That tiny experiment didn't change my personality overnight, but it showed me something important. My analytical habits weren't inherently harmful. They simply needed boundaries. There were still moments when careful thinking genuinely mattered. A few months later, I faced a complicated work decision involving a long-term project. Instead of rushing, I deliberately slowed down, gathered information, asked uncomfortable questions, and considered scenarios that others hadn't noticed. The extra analysis revealed a problem hidden inside one of the proposed plans. Solving it early saved weeks of work for everyone involved. For once, my tendency to keep thinking until everything fit together wasn't treated as a flaw. Yet the opposite happened later that same week, when I spent 15 minutes deciding which notebook to buy. Standing there, staring at identical notebooks, I suddenly started laughing at myself. A stranger glanced over, probably wondering what was so funny about office supplies. I finally picked one at random and walked away smiling. The notebook wasn't the point. I had started recognizing when my mind was solving a real problem, and when it was simply following its usual habit. Conversations changed too. When I found myself replaying something someone had said, I learned to ask a simple question before allowing my thoughts to spiral. Is there missing information I can actually obtain? Sometimes the answer was yes. Instead of inventing explanations, I sent a message asking for clarification. More often than not, the response turned out to be much simpler than the elaborate theories my imagination had constructed. Other times there was no additional information available. Those situations were harder, because my mind still wanted closure. But at least I recognized what it was searching for. It wasn't certainty, it was completeness. Knowing the difference made those restless evenings feel less mysterious. Looking back now, I don't remember the expensive purchases I carefully optimized, or the countless tiny decisions that consumed entire afternoons. What I remember are the moments when I finally understood why my mind behaved the way it did. The conversations that stayed with me weren't signs that I was broken. The endless comparisons weren't always evidence that I lacked confidence. Sometimes they reflected a brain that naturally kept searching until the picture felt whole. Understanding that didn't eliminate the habit, but it replaced years of quiet self-criticism with something gentler. I still catch myself comparing 20 versions of the simple purchase, or replaying a conversation after everyone else has forgotten it. The difference is that now, every so often, I smile because I recognize the familiar pattern instead of fighting it. And strangely enough, recognizing it has made it much easier to decide when a question deserves another hour of thought, and when it's finally time to close the tab and let the day end.